In my opinion, this video is massively important for anyone who's growing potatoes. Guten Yardening, everybody! In this video, we're going to talk about selection, storage, and handling of seed potatoes. And this is such an important part of planting and attempting to grow the most food for your family. Now, every once in a while, we'll come across a resource that is so valuable to us that we want to share it with everybody else. And in this case, we found a resource from the University of Maine, and we're going to have a link to it in the description, but we're going to talk a little bit about what their extension school has shown to be best practices for selecting seed potatoes. And this is so cool and so meaningful to us because it really helps us to focus in on pieces of this process that we really hadn't spent our time considering before. You know, whenever you think about planting potatoes or seed potatoes in the ground, of course it makes sense that you want to pick good seed potatoes, but oftentimes when we focus on improving our yield, where do we focus? We focus on timing, we focus on the soil, which makes a lot of sense because you have to have the appropriate soil. And all of that is incredibly important. I mean, if you don't plant in the right soil or you plant at the wrong time of the year, you're not going to get the yield you want. So you can control those pieces for sure, or do your best to control them. But a piece that is often lacking is being selective when it comes to your seed potatoes. And so that's actually where we're going to focus the content of this video. You can see I have in front of me 5 different varieties of seed potatoes, and we're going to talk about the aspects of these and what makes them a good or a less good candidate for putting in the ground to give us the results that we want. So the first thing we want to take into account is the health of our seed potatoes. And in this case, I'm not referring to whether or not they're squishy, although that might be a part of it. I'm talking about if there are any signs of visible disease. Sometimes there's a kind of black mold that grows on the outside of these potatoes if they've been improperly stored. I mean, there are lots of things that you can see externally on the seed potatoes that can make you decide whether or not they should go into the ground. But my opinion is that if you have the opportunity to plant good, healthy seed potatoes and you have some that are clearly not so healthy, don't risk it. It doesn't take much for disease to get into the potatoes once they're in the ground. And so if you're providing an avenue in by planting unhealthy seed potatoes, that starting point is not where you want to be. So picking healthy seed potatoes that visually pass that health inspection check is a great starting point. And now we get down to what I consider to be a really interesting aspect of this resource, one that helps us really understand where these potatoes are in the process of growing and being good quality seed potatoes. And it comes back to a question that I see often asked online, which is something like, look at my seed potato. It's got massive sprouts. Can I still plant it? And the answer to that I often see is, yes, you can still plant it. Of course you can still plant it. In fact, all you have to do is lay it sideways, cover it with soil, and these will still pop up and you can still grow them. Well, that's true. You can definitely plant these and you will likely get some results. But as this resource states, there are reasons why you would not want to plant these versus a potato that looked like this. And that helps us focus into the age of the seed potato. And that aspect is so important when it comes to understanding whether or not we're going to actually have vigorous growth from our seed potatoes once we plant them. And then beyond that, what the tubers that develop are going to look like in the end. So what I have on the table in front of me are what I would consider to be the various stages of seed potato development, from the young to the middle age to the old seed potato. Now, the only example of a seed potato that I don't have on here is one called the no-top seed potato, which is one that is so old that the ends of these sprouts actually develop tiny tubers, and there's really no point at all in planting those in the ground because you're going to see no vigorous growth and any kind of stress by weather, any kind of stress at all during the growing season, and you're going to get next to nothing. So there's no point in planting those. So let's look up close first at a young seed potato. Now this is a Yukon Gold variety potato, and you can see that I would consider this to be a young potato because what we have are mostly sprouts at the apical end. So the only place where we're seeing sprouts right now is at the one end of the seed potato, and we see, I mean, the tiniest of sprouts starting out elsewhere, but there's really not much else coming out in terms of the eyes of these potatoes. And so we're at the young end, and if we are to grow this particular potato right now, before we let it chit a little bit further, if we grow it right now, what we're going to see is likely fewer sprouts overall once it's in the ground, and on top of that, maybe the tubers will be a little bit bigger, but because there will be fewer, is that really what we want? Do we want to sacrifice numbers for a few bigger sprouts? And now this variety, this is our red Lakota, which is a great variety here in our area to grow. This is somewhere between that young and middle-aged. We're seeing the development of sprouts all around from the eyes on these potatoes. Yes, we're seeing that development, so we're not quite at that 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch sprout size that we really want as we put it in the ground, but we're definitely seeing more than just that apical sprouting. We're seeing those sprouts everywhere. So this is going to provide us with probably more sprouts just in general than we were going to get from the young potato if we don't let this wait a little bit longer. But again, still, it's not quite to where we want to be in terms of a middle-aged potato. And here we have what we call our superior potato. That's the brand. It's not because it's somehow better than the other potatoes. This is what I would call a middle-aged potato. And according to our resource, this is the time, if you want the most sprouts, if you want the most tubers that are going to be of a good size, this is the time that you want to plant your seed potatoes. You want these sprouts to be all over the potato. Again, 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch. This is the perfect size for what we're looking for and the perfect age for a seed potato for what we're looking for. We should see vigorous growth. We should see great results. We should see really nice production from seed potatoes that are middle-aged. That's really where we want our sweet spot to be in terms of seed potato planting. Now beyond this, we have our older or our old-aged potatoes, and you can see what happens when you've got seed potatoes that are too old. In addition to the shriveling piece, which isn't necessarily the biggest concern, we have these sprouts that are weak, they're longer, they're really not going to provide us with vigorous growth once they get into the ground. We've waited too long. This one has been stored improperly, and we're going to get to that storage here in just a little bit, but it's been stored improperly, and so what we're likely to have from this is lots and lots of different sprouts. That will probably happen, but then the tubers will not develop the way we want them to. They will stay at that smaller size. They won't have the energy really to bulk up. And so if we want to have a whole bunch of small tubers, then maybe we go with this. But realistically, my thought is if you can get access to these middle-aged potatoes, if you can get access even to the younger ones and allow them to sit a little bit, I think what you're going to find is you're going to get much better results, a much better yield. So to make a long story short, your goal should be to pick a middle-aged potato if you want the most vigorous growth with the best production overall. So understanding what that looks like is key. And so now that brings us down to what the resource talks about, and I love the way the resource talks about this, the decision to cut or not to cut your potatoes when you're planting them. And I'm sure you have your preference as to how you handle your potatoes and how you cut them or not. Maybe there's some rule of thumb that you always abide by, but one thing that the article talks about is that an ideal seed potato size is somewhere between 1.5, 1.75 ounces to 2 ounces. That's a great size at a minimum. And that anything under that size, something really small like a 1 ounce potato is going to not perform as well. Again, what does this all come back to? It comes back to us wanting a vigorously growing plant that's going to produce well. So what I'm not suggesting is that if you plant something that's too small, you won't see some growth. What I am saying is that according to this resource, and it makes perfect sense to me, if you plant really small seed potatoes, you're not going to get the kind of yield you want. Similarly, if you cut a seed potato that's too small, you're not going to get the yield you want. So the ideal size, 1.75 to 2 ounces at a minimum, means that if you have a potato, and actually this one I've already weighed, and you can see it in comparison to my hand. This is a 3-ounce seed potato. Since this is a 3-ounce seed potato right on the nose, we wouldn't cut this one down. Not because we couldn't cut it down, not because we couldn't just cut this in half. And you'll probably see many people suggest, oh yeah, definitely cut this in half. But because the idea is maximum yield, and this size is going to help us get some really nice growth. Now we have bigger potatoes here. This is about 4.5 to 5 ounces of potato, which means we can cut this in half and we will get plenty of seed potato to go into the ground that's still going to provide us with that great growth. And different varieties, if you're growing like a russet potato, for example, need bigger pieces. They need a bigger piece overall. So that's something that I think, again, you can reflect back, look back at the resource and see exactly what's suggested, and look up specific varieties to see what the ideal seed potato size is. But that's not all. I think what's really important, and we addressed this in one of our earlier potato videos where we talked about our Magic Molly purple potatoes, and we said when you cut a potato, one, you need to make sure that you use a sharp knife so that you're not ripping or creating any tears in the potato as you're cutting through. But two, you have to let the potato rest a while after you've cut it so that it develops a second skin. And I think if you consider all that's in your soil, how it's such a living organism, how there's so much going on in there, and that you're opening up a potato's cells that were never naturally meant to be exposed to the air. You have to give them some time to adjust before you put them in the ground, or you're really opening up that opportunity for some kind of infection or disease to get into those potatoes. And so there's going to be a time period depending on the age of the potato, so understanding that piece. Depending on the age of the potato, depending on the temperature, there's going to be a time period that you need for that potato to, we'll call it scab over or create that second skin before you want to put it in the ground. And then what the resource calls the most underrated part of planting, and this makes perfect sense, is the care that you give the potatoes after you've cut them. Now typically when we talk about planting seed potatoes and care, we talk about not knocking a sprout off. That's the last thing you want to do. You knock a sprout off, you've destroyed an opportunity for growth. But on top of that, when you cut these potatoes in half or in thirds and you open up all of that surface area, you're also opening up a whole bunch more sharp corners or sharp edges. And those sharp edges are easy to knock into things, to create damage right along the edge, and that will cause its own kind of problems whenever you're talking about damaging cells that are going to be needed for the plant growth, damaging cells and creating, again, an entrance for any kind of potential disease in the future. So it's not just about knowing that, you know, a 3-ounce size potato is a good size potato to just put in the ground, and anything smaller than 1.5 ounces you should probably avoid planting if you want good growth. It's also about understanding that these bigger potatoes, if you're going to cut them in pieces, and that's a great way to improve yield and to give you more seed potatoes, you need to be careful when it comes to actually caring after you've cut them. You want the best quality seed potatoes to go in the ground that are going to give you the best chance at a vigorous, high yielding crop. That's our overall goal of production in the first place. Make sure you check out the link to this resource in the description. Again, it is a fantastic resource. It has shifted my mindset when it comes to the amount of care we give our seed potatoes before they go into the ground, and also when it comes to selecting the best seed potatoes. It makes a huge difference in terms of yield, and we can't wait to see how that bears itself out here in the next couple of months. Well, we hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, don't forget to give us a like, leave us a comment, remember to share and subscribe, and most importantly, remember, when you're with us, you are good to grow.